Women's International League for Peace and Freedom show The Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carver, 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch the show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10 p.m., Friday morning at 6 a.m., or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, Wolf Wake Up Call. I'm Mira Schwinzer here with our host, Lori Hoyt, and Emily O'Hara on the camera. Today, our special guest is Michal Osterweil.
Hi, I'm glad you could come. I've been trying to get you on this show since last summer.
Oh my goodness, has it been that
Well,
long?
that's when Sammy mentioned that you would be really good to have on the show, and he told me what you do, teaching capitalism, and I said, gosh, you know, we all worry about it, but we don't know that as much as we should about it, and I don't think we've had ever anybody on to really explain very much about it. So I'm looking forward to talking about capitalism and learning more about it. And so, welcome. And
Thank you so much.
yeah, so how did you get interested in capitalism?
So I have to correct a little bit. So I do end up teaching about capitalism, but
About capitalism.
I am a student of social movements. So I have been a researcher and participant and writer about social movements for, you know, going on 20-something years, maybe around 20 years, let's say. And the questions led me, well, I was trying to understand anti-systemic movements. In particular, I was looking at the alter globalization movement, known as the, you know, corporate justice in global Seattle, is what a lot of people in the U.S. know about. The Zapatistas in Mexico are a huge sort of source of inspiration, but also a group that I've studied a lot. And so I really started understanding capitalism through anti-capitalists, right? And so, and I actually think the first theorist of capitalism is Karl Marx. You know, his books, Capital, 2 massive volumes, are actually the most thorough descriptions, and he was writing it as a description of a system that people were just trying to make sense of, and he was definitely critical of it. But, you know, in the 60s and 70s, the right wing got really interested in reading Marx to make sense of capital too, right? So he has a really good description of it, but in general, I think you can learn a lot about what capitalism is from the critiques that people have of it, and it emerges as a system in our confrontations with it in many ways. I don't think it's as coherent as a system as a lot of people do, both on the right and the left. I think it's a lot more chaotic and complex, and that is both scary and empowering. Both of those are part of it.
Yeah, and that's where I even thought about that. I was so naive, and I'd hear it was some people talking about how bad it was, and I realized I didn't understand much. So anything I knew was from how bad it is, and I just know how things have changed in terms of our economic policies from, I think the 80s is when I particularly noticed, and you know, from the 50s, everything seemed like financially so good. People were getting more education. People, at least white people, moving on up, and then in the 80s, that's where I noticed a change in what I hear critics now call predatory capitalism. But
you got predatory capitalism, but I think the helpful, well, at least for me, the helpful shift to note is neoliberalism. So neoliberalism, which literally started to be most enforced, enacted, and the institution, well, it became the policy of our government, but also of Thatcher's government in the UK, it was like capitalism on steroids, right? So the idea of privatizing everything, deregulating everything, liberalizing, so reducing trade barriers of all kinds, right? Making everything open to the market, which in some ways was a theoretical proposition even before the Great Depression, and during World War II there were small think tanks that were sort of thinking in these terms at that time, often as like in opposition to the Keynesian understanding of what capitalism was, which is a whole other thing. But neoliberalism is Milton Friedman's brainchild in many ways. I mean, it's informed by other scholars and theorists, but the phenomenal thing to me about neoliberalism, and 1979 is kind of when we can see it coming into policy, and a lot of people saw it in Latin America first. Chile was a very important experimental playground for him actually being a public policy advisor to Pinochet.
Oh, was he?
But also New York City was one of the first places where these really radical ideas, they were extremely radical. Like in the early 40s and 50s, if you had said this was an ideal, you would have probably been thought to be a lunatic, right? So capitalism had existed, and I don't think we need to think of those as very romantically wonderful days. But, and I think neoliberalism is capitalism taken to its extreme. But again, I want to be really careful about capitalism is a set of practices and beliefs and values that is a lot messier and precarious of a constellation than sometimes it gets talked about. It's not this one big monster that we can sort of identify and say, take down that monster, right? So neoliberalism, which you're absolutely right to name the 80s, because it started in the late 70s, and globally, in particular in the 80s, through structural adjustment programs, after Mexico defaulted on something, which is a technical point, was a very extreme version of it. And that is when we talk about corporate-driven globalization and neoliberalism, in which things like everything is seen to be better in the market. That is a very particular and extreme manifestation of this economic system. One thing I do really love to say about capitalism, and I think it's important, is that we tend to think about capitalism as an economic system. But economy can't actually be separated from our culture or our politics, for that matter. But I think capitalism is better understood as a culture which encompasses economic values and choices that get made, but it can't be limited to economics. And in fact, one of capitalism's myths, and the one that neoliberalism really banks on working, is the idea that the economy can be separate from society or from cultural values. And it actually never can, but it acts as if it can. And so now we think of economics as a hard science, and it's taught it's mathematical and there's equations. But economics, when it was founded, was, part a speculative, almost philosophical, theoretical endeavor. And it made pretty intense speculations about the nature of humankind. So Adam Smith, who is in many ways the father of market-based economics and capitalism in some ways, classical economics, one would say, was, he was a philosopher. He wasn't an economist, but he founded something that we now take to be a field of human practice that is not governed by other things, when it always is, right? So for the majority of human history, humans were not driven by profit. They were not driven by individual self-interest. They were driven by reciprocity, social distribution, and maybe social status, right? That's what the historical and anthropological records show. So this idea of humans being motivated by rational economic preferences that are, greedy or self-interested, which is what so many people believe to be just how humans are, is a relatively new idea of humans that is sort of self-producing, right? It creates an idea of itself, and it's effective for certain things, but it isn't actually the truth of who humans are. Mm-hmm. It's a cultural product. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I was just thinking back, did that, in terms of the profit motive and everything, did that start with the, I was just thinking, somehow popped in my mind about Holland and the tulips. I don't know, is that a form of capitalism where all of a sudden tulips became so valuable in terms of the money you could get for them, or use them as a medium of exchange, or does that not at all fit in with any of this?
Well, I don't know that example of Holland with tulips, so we could talk about it. I mean, the story of money developing out of barter is a whole other thing that we could get into, and there's a really great book by David Graeber called Debt, and I can't think of the full definition of it, but one of the points he makes in that book, which I think is a very valid one, is the sort of evolutionary story that Adam Smith helps crystallize and turn into the story we all learn at school, that money developed out of barter and is this very straight linear evolutionary process, is pretty mythical. And barter was never, money is older than barter in some ways, and money originated as debt, right? So there would be even in Mesopotamia, there would be a chart of someone owing someone else something, mm-hmm. and it was usually done amongst people you knew and that you had obligations to, and it wasn't seen as this impersonal profit motive. It was a way of exchange, right? barter was actually more done in the ceremonial way, often with warring tribes or tribes that you didn't know, and there would be all this stuff around it that had a lot more to do with like power and position, and there's a lot of things that don't really fit into our ideas of money in that whole process. So I don't know where that fits into the tulip and Holland thing, but one of Adam Smith's important contributions was to say, the wealth of a society does not come from its bullion. Like, it's not an amount of gold that the government possesses and that's wealth, right? He says wealth comes from labor, right? Wealth is actually produced by the glove maker and all of these things. He is, in some ways, the originator of the labor theory of value. But Marx and this other guy, Ricardo, who I know less, but they are the ones who we use more today, because Smith actually talked about the labor theory of value as something like, what are you willing to give up in order to have something? So in this vision, he thought, it makes sense that a park ranger would be paid less than a banker, but not because his labor is less valuable, but rather because he has such an enjoyable job. Yeah. So it's interesting, right, how that's evolved. Whereas Marx's theory of labor that I think is useful is that, the capitalist makes a profit by exploiting. So making extra, the surplus value, quote unquote, if you want to get technical, from labor that people in the factories produce. So capitalists don't actually produce what they make. They supposedly put in the risk, they make the prior investments, and therefore that's why they deserve that extra surplus value. But again, that the wealth of a nation isn't something fixed is what Adam Smith really offers. And he says that these economic activities, and also interestingly, and I think, I don't mean to romanticize or vilify Adam Smith. He was trying to look at what motivates human interactions, and he thought trade was a very social act that encouraged sympathy. His first book was actually, I can't remember if it's called, I usually know, something on moral sympathy before Wealth of Nations, and he was just interested in trade as a way of interacting, and he was from Scotland, and he saw trade as a really useful thing for this small island, right? So again, just interesting, because he also did not have the extreme views that people like Milton Friedman did of the state. He actually was very worried about the tendency towards monopoly. He was very worried about the propensity of people to want more and more and more, and so that he actually saw a need for the state to sort of stop capital from, he didn't call it capital, but from wealth from accruing in too much in certain hands, and he thought there was very specific needs for the state to do infrastructure amongst other things, right?
So that then we get up to Marx, and so where did that go from there? From the ones who disagreed or disagreed with Marx but wanted to learn from how he put it. You said both those who agreed and disagreed really studied his theories on
that. I mean, so one of the things that I think is interesting about Marx is that Marx's actual oeuvre is variegated, right? And he was trying to make sense of a massive time of change, modernity, as it was happening, and the Industrial Revolution, right? So he's trying to make sense of it, and there's the early Marx, who I actually really love, in which he notices it's almost more of an existential and spiritual problem that he notices about man being separated from what he calls his species being. And this is where he notes terms like alienation and estrangement, right? And so the problem he sees is that we have this human, the nature of humans is to produce things, to make things in the world, right? To have our vocation, if you will. I don't know if he used that language, I don't think he did. But that when we have to sell our labor for wages in order to survive, this is a robbing humanity of this natural creative propensity, right, to be in the world. So that's early Marx, and I think he's very important, especially today, because I think people's levels of alienation and estrangement from their own humanity and the artistic or creative things that they can do in the world is so visible. People in various parts of the economic spectrum, I would say probably many very rich people are very alienated from themselves, right? The nature of the monetization and commodification of everything, which is also something that Marx really gives to us, is that he shows that with the rising of machines and this sort of industrial production, men are turned into commodities, but we are also raising commodities to this almost like religious deification, you know.
Yeah, so before that, the craft person took pride in what they were
Yes,
making.
exactly.
So all of it was done by hand.
Yes.
The crafts, women did the weaving and made their clothes and all of that. People took pride in and they used their hands, and the product that they made was something they had pride in. Once you got where the machines are there, where then people are hooked up to machines, and it's churning it out, it would be hard to take personal pride in that. So then the thing that you're getting would be your wage, but you're alienated from your work.
Yeah, and I think this is a part of there's a piece of history that I think is one of the most important stories to tell about the period in which capitalism is like gaining dominance.
Yeah.
For especially people that care about women, and also the importance of the subjugation of women to capitalism, to the rise of capitalism. I mean, that actually, like, I don't think we could have the capitalist system that we have today if there's this wonderful book called Caliban and the Witch by an author named Silvia Federici. And in this book, she goes back to like feudal times and the heretical movements and shows that, and makes an argument that the witch burnings were actually part of the necessity to rob women of their power over reproduction on the one hand, but also their knowledge and their value. So at that time, women were the keepers of magic knowledge or herbal knowledge. They were
healers.
They were the healers, and they had this whole realm that science could not dominate, and they were respected for that, right? They also had control over whether they wanted to be pregnant or not, and they would take herbs and do other things, and it was normal, right? So to name millions of women as witches, among other people, right? There were other very horrific things done during this period, and others created to be unqualified and other, right? That period of time was essential to sort of creating an idea that, well, not just an idea, literally making it impossible for you to be in control of whether you're going to give birth or not, therefore, like, providing the labor, right, for this growing industrial machine, right? But also sort of imposing this idea that there's only one legitimate kind of knowledge, right? And so women and their subjugation and making inferior of women's knowledge and also their labor, right? So now they're doing the work at home, which before wasn't considered less valuable. I'm not trying to say that there wasn't patriarchy, I'm not trying to date it, but the actual consolidation of this idea of women as completely inferior, locked in the house, having to depend on men for a wage labor is tied to the advent of capitalism. Right. And it's actually quite pivotal to it, in my opinion.
And I don't think most of us did not realize how many women were burned as witches.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I think I read somewhere something like it's a Holocaust over a couple of centuries, but it was not, I think at least 9 to 11 million women.
Yes.
And sometimes in Germany, almost a lot of the women in the town. And I don't think people have any idea. So once I started finding that out, I could no longer get a kick out of Halloween. Halloween is just,
I see.
I just couldn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, we tend to call someone witch or, barbarian when it's other than us. And that is actually bringing me to another point that I wanted to really make clear about Marx and his critics and admirers. One of the things that I think we do have to recognize about Marx, and I find many of his writings very useful and helpful, but Marx believed in modernity. He believed in development. And if you look at the way he wrote about India and other places, he was quite racist. But he believed in growth, and he did believe in sort of this there's upward development of humankind. So he saw us going through feudalism and going through this period of capitalism to get to the other side of a period where there might be a classless society. And that's very problematic for a number. One, because it is quite a Eurocentric version of the world, and white supremacist, one could argue. And I want to say white supremacy in the sense of a principle of white supremacy that sees civilization and barbarism, right? Which is something else we could talk about. But also, it's very problematic environmentally today because this idea, so communism and capitalism both shared this belief in development, right? And so there wasn't an opposition in how, what our relationship to the earth is. And that's why the piece with women, I think, is so important in that whole period, because women in having a magical or more cosmological view of the world, and others did too. I don't want to suggest that it's
The
just
indigenous
women.
peoples did.
Right, First Nations, and that's, I mean, you actually keep seeing these similar, it's what in Marxist terms it would be primitive accumulation, so the violence necessary to make it seem like you have to sell your labor for wages. It's not a natural, evolutionary, easy process. You have to like force people to do it, right? So you had commons that had to be enclosed, right? And the commons were places where you could graze your sheep or grow your vegetables, and no one needed to sell their labor to survive, right? You might do it for extra. So all of these ideas of the commons, if you think about it, as an essential piece of the growth of capitalism, that has been really destructive in our understanding of our relationship to nature, but also to what we collectively steward, right? Like that,
Yeah.
the fact that we've objectified everything is seen as a resource to be made profit from, to grow from, economically speaking, is part and parcel of this vision. And Marx wasn't very critical, from my knowledge at least, and I am not an expert, and I'm happy for people to intervene in that, of that vision of development, which I think we really have to consider. And so many contemporary anti-capitalists who also are concerned about climate change and other ecological things can't simply be like, there's not one, it's not like communism is the answer, right? Because communism was also an industrial developmentalist version of the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think we have, that experiment played out.
Yeah, right. I mean, we all know that. It's just interesting because in my classes, a lot of times people assume when I'm criticizing capitalism that I'm promoting this other thing called communism, and I think that's part of the way the U.S. likes to play black and white rather than just being able to say, okay, here's a system that has many problems. Let's look for solutions, right?
Yeah. So with the young people in your classes, do they come into it with any preconceived notions, or how do they receive the information and knowledge that you're trying to impart?
Well, I love my students, and I learn a lot from them, and I, for the most part, get really great feedback. That it's like kind of light bulbs going off, and it, more than having preconceived notions, it's recognizing that they had never questioned that this is the way things are. Right?
That's what I wondered.
Yeah. So, and I think that's actually a big thing. So, one of the things that I spend quite a long time on in my class that is not exclusively about capitalism, but it's about globalization, which you have to understand capitalism in order to understand, but is the ability to sort of historicize things and denaturalize things. And that includes capitalism, but it also includes race, and it also includes the idea of the nation state. And I talk a lot about this notion of economocentrism, which is not my original. Economocentrism, meaning the fact that we live in a world in which, the news starts every morning and says, it's been a great day, and they're referring to the stock market or to GDP rise and fall, right? Whereas a GDP, and there's like a funny quote that I use from a textbook that says, divorce rates are up, so people have been hiring lawyers, antidepressant sales are up, gun sales are up, everyone needs to buy bottled water because of the pollution in the river. Like, GDP is up, right? But is that really a good year, And so the fact that we can actually have a normative or sort of value-based critique of this economic system and not just assume, well, this is just the way the economy works. So one of the fascinating things to me about what's happened is this belief that the economy operates outside of our human political and cultural choices, because it never has. People like Milton Friedman would have us believe that it does, even though if you actually listen to his speeches, he kind of plays it on both sides, which is really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like the market is this mystical thing that sort of goes. No matter what we humans do, the market has its own way of operating. Like this talk about magical thinking.
Exactly. It is exactly that, and it's. So, there's a couple of great books that I really recommend that are, easy to read, popular. Well, one is really easy to read, the other one is not. So the first is called The Value of Nothing by Raj Patel.
Wait, I gotta write this down.
The Value of Nothing by Raj Patel. Super great, very accessible. He actually goes through a lot of the economists that I'm talking about, and I use it as a textbook in my class often. But he starts the book with this quote from Oscar Wilde that says, "Today everyone knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." Right? Which is at the heart of what this system has done for us, right? Because my students, I think, feel literally when we're talking about economics, disempowered. They don't understand that the economy is something that we make with our choices, right? And not just like our individual choices, but our political, cultural ideas of what we want to value, but also what we want to say no to, you know, like. The other book that is really a beautiful book, but not an easy read, definitely like more of an academic book, but is called The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi.
By Karl
Polanyi, Polanyi. And The Great Transformation is written in 1944, you know, after the Great Depression during World War II, and right around the same time that actually the world economic system as we know it today, the Bretton Woods meeting, takes place that same year.
That was after the Second World War?
Right at the end of it, 1944.
And the book by Karl Polanyi
was Great Transformation.
The Great Transformation.
And he's talking about the Industrial Revolution. And it's amazing to me because in 1944 he basically already says, like, it might seem weird, there's a quote that says something, it might seem weird, but it is already clear that this transformation that he sees, he calls it a satanic mill that ground men into masses. That's a quote of his. Like, what satanic mill ground men into masses? And it's like a transformation so great that it's like the human nature has been transformed, kind of like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, but not in a beautiful way. He's pretty horrified by this, but he says, you know, it is inevitable that man will face the annihilation of nature. In 1944, he sees the system going there, right? And he also coins this very helpful for me term of the myth of the self-regulating market. The myth of the self-regulating market that is based on this other myth that is the disembedding of the economy from society.
Okay, so what is this?
Breakdown.
Oh, okay. She was writing this little tiny writing, and I should have my glasses on. So yes, we're going to take a break. Well, this is so interesting. Okay, break time.
This is Wilf's Wake Up Call on WCOMLP, Chapel Hill in Carver, 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMFM.org.
Yeah, do we have any announcements? Is there anything coming up? This is, well, you know, it's not exactly an announcement, but I got thinking a couple of days ago that I think it's March 8th is International Women's Day. And I wish I'd thought of this earlier, because it would have been nice if Wilf being the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, that some years we have done something special. And I think there's just so much going on politically that did not come up into our consciousness. So let's all try to think of next year getting ourselves together. Maybe we could all wear white on March 8th as like the suffragettes, or we could do something on our own or with our family. But March 8th will be International Women's Day, and I think sometimes other women around the world do some special things. So keep your ear out for that. I think that's about it. So we'll get back to our guests. We're talking about capitalism, and our guest has been teaching it, or part of group changes.
Well, I teach about social movements, but I do teach about just globalization too. So I'm just saying how I got interested in it was through the social movements that I studied.
Yeah. And our guest is Michal
Osterweil.
And I'm getting close.
Close.
Osterweil. It was almost like Oscar Wilde.
Yes. Yeah.
That'll help keep it in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so she's giving us the name of some books if we want to continue our education about this. It's really funny. Until, about 15, 20 years ago, you're right. I mean, the news was not so much always on economics. There seemed to be other things took people's attention. A lot, maybe we had the Cold War, maybe that was, but you know, there was so much more that occupied, that would be newsworthy. And now everything is economics, everything is the stock market. You know, everything starts with that and ends with that. And so all of these dire forecasts, what did Oscar Wilde say, the cost of everything and the value of nothing, that is increasingly what we're struggling with right now. Yeah. Although I'm hoping that when things get so bad, there's some sort of a backlash, and I think climate change may be coming into the forefront as finally the media paying some attention because it's forced to.
Yeah.
You know, when you have half of California on fire and floods all over the Midwest, it's finally, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say if we're in time, right? But
Yeah,
Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, says in some ways climate change is our best opportunity yet to address capitalism, right? And the problems of capitalism, right? Because the same causes of climate change are at the core of capitalism. And, you know, as she points out, it is no coincidence that the climate denying movement has been so funded, highly funded by, you know, oil companies and others that have been profiting from people not knowing about climate change and not worrying about climate change. So I mean, one would hope it's getting to the point where you're like, I'm not, you know, I'm an optimist. And I mean, the beautiful thing to me is not only is it a solution for climate change in the sense of like crisis and catastrophe, but I think what I find and what I see from my students and also the movements that I look at and work with is that the solutions to capitalism are also things that like bring us back to our humanity a little bit. And people are suffering tremendously right now from loneliness, from addiction, from depression, anxiety. You know, these like are problems of the first world, right? And I'm not saying they don't exist elsewhere, and I'm not trying to diminish them because I think they're true and real, but I think part of what capitalism is premised on is this myth of us as individuals, you know, and the notion that we are individuals and that we have to raise ourselves up by our bootstrap, that we can't depend on community, that, you know, mothers should be like able to work 9 to 5 and raise their kids and, you know, have a social life and a sex life, whatever, like
and look good at the same
and look good, of course, is like it's weighing on people, you know, and what there are movements around the world of people like, you know, some people would call it there's work share movements or degrowth movements that are saying like I need less income and more time, right? Like I need to actually make a point of and not just income, like I want to spend this many hours growing my food, not only because it's healthy and it's environmental, but because it's like soul nourishing and I can do it with my neighbors and my kids, you know? And so a lot of the solutions to the economic problems and to the environmental problems are also solutions to our like human problem of like being hurt and broken and unhealthy. And I think our unhealth is definitely a product of an industrial food system and a lot of modern diseases, you know, cardiac like diseases being I think the #1 killer in our country at least, but also, you know, the fact that we are unhappy. I mean, I'm still struck by there's evidence-based research that says that you are way more likely to die from loneliness than from smoking, drinking, like in the sense that they've done research and show that if people have tight-knit communities, especially intergenerational relationships, like above a certain, you know, base level of income, people need to have something to survive, but their health is much more adversely affected by loneliness than these other things that we are told to focus on, right? So that's the other piece to me about understanding capitalism as a cultural system, right? Like it's killing us in all these different ways, right? And, you know, the amount of wealth people are after these days, it's a pursuit of something that they're never going to, like it's impossible to attain it because it's actually because you're not dealing with something within you and within our need for human connection. You know?
And it seems like, at least you hope that more and more people are sort of having some consciousness. I mean, right now, the thought of a community, people, that's getting to be a favorite word for people. You know, searching for it, not quite sure how to get it or what it is, but realizing that they're longing for something. And
I think the challenge is we have to like realize that we can't have it all, in the sense that like some people want community but the 6-figure salary, and like I'm not saying you can't have this, I don't know, but I just think we need to start thinking about community as like actually depending on one another, and in order to depend on one another we actually need to support one another, right? Which might mean like less monetary income and more like, you know, help from friends or help from community, and that might mean like a lesser, you know, income, but probably an increased quality of life and increased wealth in relationships and in skills and in, you know, yeah, the fact that we define wealth actually by money is pretty interesting, you know, because you can be impoverished in a lot of ways if you have a lot of money. Like it's not.
It certainly
yeah.
can be. We can look at certain examples of
Right.
people in the
Yes.
forefront of the news, and
Yes.
and realize that they were lacking a lot of soul.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I remember there was a book, David Corton, The Great Turning.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, there's going to be change whether we choose it or not, whether we want it or not, but it's going to be forced on us, and it's really good if we could prepare for it. And he talked about the three-legged stool, you know, and one was going to be our economy collapsing, and one was going to be, at that point they thought that there was a finite amount of oil. Unfortunately, that's changed, and we're going to have to just ignore some of the oil that's there or cap it. But the other thing was that climate change, and that was going to force us to make changes. And it would be nice if we could be prepared and be making changes so it wasn't before it was a total disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. And so another author that I love is Joanna Macy, who has a book called Act of Hope: How to Face the Mess Run Without Going Crazy.
My church, we just studied it.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that she talks about is the three stories, right? So we have business as usual, which is like get the economy going, just fix the economy. It's business like profit growth. We just need to get green jobs. We just need to get, right? Like we need to keep it all faced on a growing economy, but we can maybe adjust what those sectors are, right? The second story, which in some ways fits with what a lot of I know environmental activists and people really facing stuff, is called the Great Unraveling, in which it's all going to hell in a handbasket, and it's almost already too late, and it's very a cynical story. And I'm not saying, I mean, I walk into that story a lot, like I can feel it, and I'm not denying its truth. But the third story, which she builds on, I'm not sure if she builds on Corton or if they're both building on Thomas Berry, but this idea of the Great Turning.
Yes.
And the Great Turning is already happening. That's what she says. You just need to be able to see it with those eyes. And so it's all these people that are working to create, you know, community gardens and work co-ops and community kitchens and, you know, like, she sees this as three-pronged. She says we have to be doing holding actions, so protests to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline and all these things that we see around us. I mean, I know that one's passed, but that was on my mind. And then, you know, the creating resilient institutions and actions, right? So building different kinds of institutions, economics and otherwise. And then the third one is a shift in consciousness. And for her, that shift in consciousness is very supported by her Buddhist philosophy. But essential to her Buddhist philosophy is a non-dualist, or not what I would talk about as a relational worldview, right? Which means like part of the problem with capitalism, and again, this is why I think it's so important that we understand it as a culture and as a way of thinking and knowing, is that it sees man and the world as separate, and like as if you could talk about an objective world, right? As if you could talk about the river over there and then man over here, like there's a way in which that leads us to a relationship of domination and exploitation, as opposed to so many worldviews in which the river is part of our, they're the lifeblood of our land, right? Or in some cultures they are part of our ancestors, right? Like and a more animist view of the world, right? So, but relational worldviews, which come from all over, Buddhist, indigenous peoples from all over, even within science, which is pretty interesting, it really helps you to get a more hopeful, in some ways, vision of what's possible, because we already are enmeshed in so many relationships, right? That being said, yes, there are a lot of reasons to worry, you know?
Yeah.
But again, what makes me hopeful is that the solutions to all of these crises all require us to sort of look towards these more human, community-based ways of being. And community being with our non-human family as well, right? So
well, I remember Carborough had a whole big day not that many years ago where they were looking at what Carborough as a town could do to further all of that, and about taking more charge of their money, and then they were trying to look into where they put then they found out that the state wouldn't let
Wouldn't
them
let
put it
them,
in the
yeah.
local bank.
Yeah.
But then also starting some, we're sharing of the older skills with knitting and
Yeah.
just different skills,
Yeah.
gardening,
Yeah.
carpentry, just skills
Mhm.
that people could take pride in
Yeah.
again and do more for themselves and
Yeah.
feel that they had to earn money to pay somebody to do
Right.
this, that, or the other for them. But
Right.
it was a wonderful day.
Yeah.
I mean, that the whole, the Century Center was just filled. I mean, it was not everybody in town, but it was
Right.
a lot of people took part in that.
Mhm.
So that was so encouraging that you were with other people who shared your concern about how to
Mhm.
make this a better world, a better town, how we
Yeah.
can help each other.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it was like a beginning of trying to look at things that way.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways to look at it that's also empowering is to realize, just like that day, a lot of the things we're already doing are not explainable solely through the ways capitalism wants you to understand them, right? Like we
Mhm.
all are participating in economic practices that are not profit motivated, that are
Mm-hmm.
like reciprocal, or that
Yeah.
are more because you want to help, you know what I mean, or just because it feels good,
Yeah.
than just being motivated by rational economic choices, right? So
Yeah.
there's this another fun book, I think, called Take Back the Economy, and it's a guide to, I can't remember, but it's by these two feminist geographers. They go by one name, J.K. Gibson Graham, and one of the things that they argue for is understanding, you know, like they talk about the economy as an iceberg, and we have these very few things that we see at the top of the icebergs, like wage labor and very specific things that fit into what we think of. But then they have all these other things like volunteering, babysitting for your friends, giving extra crops that you grew in your garden to, you know, like all these things that are already there.
Sharing.
Yeah, sharing. Like we do a lot of stuff already. Like people DIY building, or, you know, I call my neighbor all the time and say like, hey, could you help me? You know, I need a cup of sugar. Obviously that's one, but like, you know,
Yeah.
we built our house, you know, with straw bale and had to rely on a lot of help, and people had so much fun
You did a straw
together.
bale house?
Yeah, we did a straw bale house. Sammy, I will say I did help some, but I was growing our baby in my stomach at the time. So
You were doing your own
yeah,
growing.
growing in the house, yeah. But you know, there's a lot of ways in which the stuff that capitalism doesn't want you to realize, just like they didn't want people to realize that women already had knowledge and didn't need, you know what I mean, to have to
Yes.
self, like, is that they make us believe that we're only valuable in the amount of money we earn from our wages, right? Even though we're doing so much other stuff that might even give us more joy and more wealth, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, and even in this country, in the history where they, the community would get together and do a barn raising,
Mm-hmm.
and then help each other
Right.
build the barn.
Yeah.
They would, you know, we have a history
Yeah.
before people got so dependent on machine-made things, of, you know, baking bread and sharing it with your
Yeah.
neighbor, of
Yeah.
helping when there was a sick child or whatever. There was always this, we do have that in our history and
Yeah.
hopefully in our genes.
Right.
So it's like to remind people, it's almost like we've been in a bad dream, like it's time to wake up,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, and I just want to make sure I name it, is one of the risks that we get into when we talk about the like good old days of local, you know,
Yeah.
is the racism in our past too, right? And I have to remind myself that too, because it's, you know, one of the things that people don't do a very good job of is imagining community in a truly diverse sense, and also realizing how capitalism itself has been premised on that sort of us versus them idea. And that's actually the only reason that we have racism, was to make poor white people feel, you know, like they had more in common with rich white people than they did with their coworkers that were in the
Yes,
field,
which is still,
right?
of course, going on today.
Right, and so one of the risks when we just talk about community and like without mentioning the
Yeah.
need for like active anti-racism and active like deconstruction of whiteness, or understanding the problem of whiteness, which I think is actually more accurate these days than talking about it in a different way, is to really to recognize, first of all, the ways in which the prison industrial complex destroys certain communities on the regular, right? And so to never, just be working to build your community without being aware of other communities' destruction, right? And but on the other hand, yes, like trying to revitalize our history of having these like very, communal notions of being neighbors.
Yeah. And in the Black community, there's a lot of helping each other out.
Yeah.
But to keep in mind what we've done also to help destroy the Black communities.
Yeah, I mean, the story of civil rights is definitely, there's so many positive pieces to it, but I mean, this is one of those stories where capitalism in its complexity, like the need to exploit another market, so that even right here, in Northside, where you had like vibrant Black-owned businesses and community gardens and people really supporting one another, and if you hear the oral histories, if you go to the Jackson Center and listen, like what it felt like to live there was, destroyed by integration in some ways, right? So like to realize, and that was one of those tricky capitalist moves, and I'm not saying it's complicated, right? It's not to say that integration shouldn't have happened but that the civil rights movement shouldn't have happened. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that there are problematic effects, largely because one of the things that happened when you opened up that community was capital speculation, and then you had big white-owned businesses that could drive out, the locally owned businesses, and that's a true local community, right? And that's the risk we run, I think, in a lot of our contemporary communities, is that they're not truly locally owned, right? And they're not diverse economically or racially.
Emily and I just went on a civil rights tour with the senior center yesterday to the one civil rights museum in Greensboro and Charlotte. And it was very interesting in Charlotte, which is happened in other places, where he gave us a history about how in 1935, when they came out with the ways for the federal government to do mortgages and loans, how they went, and I didn't realize how planned it was all over the country. They, in cahoots with the banks and the real estate people, they mapped out in each community. And I'd always heard about redlining, but I didn't know it was
so deliberate.
That it was so planned, and so they made maps back then all over the country, and now in Charlotte, which is drenched in money, with some of these beautiful buildings going up, beautiful architecture, and they had taken over what should have been by their criteria, where there's a hospital or a school that should be where you want to develop, but instead they wouldn't let Blacks. It was a Black school, big middle school, and a Black hospital, and they took it over. So now there's these other big office buildings, but there's another community there, similar to communities all over the country, where the speculators want that land, and the people are and struggling to hold on, but they don't own their homes, and so one corporation owns the land and another corporation owns the homes, and so it was each gave the history, and so it was capitalism and right laid out over and over again. I remember.
Well, and that's the other thing to remember, is this myth of the self-regulating market is so mythical. Like the amount of legislation and support that capitalists and corporations got in order to achieve the wealth, like accrual that they did, it's like there was never a self-regulating market, right? They always had, either through lobbying or even more directly in that case, right, like support. And so communities were often trying to and on their own, very vibrant, right? So you had to actively destroy what was, just like 147 through Durham.
I was just going to say, I remember when
I don't remember it, but I know the story.
And I didn't understand what was happening. I was I was a little housewife out in the suburbs, and but I just thought this doesn't seem right, because there were all these wonderful it was a whole Black business center that they destroyed, put a highway right in the middle of it. And
I think that's actually like also a really good way to explain the difference between, all economics are not bad. All societies have economics. It's simply the management of households, it's exchange of goods, right? But it's this like hyper concentration of profits for profit's sake by mega corporations that are not serving any community and not accountable to any community.
Yes.
That is, at the heart of what we're struggling with. And it's no coincidence that they've targeted Black communities, partly because of blatant white supremacy, and partly because, like, if you have a cohesive community, they're never going to allow for this, like, speculative, sheerly profit-based existence in the world. Like, humans in connection with each other just don't do that, is my really deep belief. They have to be forced to do that, right?
Yeah. So that, I think that the whole thing, I always think of capitalism, where everything's always got to be bigger and bigger. Somebody starts a nice little cookie business and they're doing fine,
Right.
but they're under all this pressure then to expand. And I'm kind of thinking, well, so is cancer, expansive. The cells grow and multiply, and it's like this unquestioning growth is good, and it can be, but a lot of times it's not. And
It's a good metaphor.
Yeah. So capitalism is a complicated thing.
It's complicated, and I think if you think about it just as you just described it, as something that, assumes, the other thing, to just going back to basics in textbook.
The assumptions.
Yeah, the assumptions, and also the assumptions that we are consumers, laborers, or capitalists, right? Like, we are so much more, and we do like to work. I think humans like to work, but not in order to have to sell or to go to a 9-to-5 job or, to make money from someone else. It's because you want to make something beautiful, or you want to, like, grow food, or, we've never, until capitalism, we've never just been people that have to buy things, like, and think that the answer to our happiness is in that, right? So there are assumptions and there are, like, world views of who we are as people that are very limited by this very complex system. And the complications come in things that we have just named, right? Like speculative capital, destruction of community, and how to oppose them, right? Because, I know for myself as someone who lives in Carver, like, the power that developers have in this town is it's terrifying, and it's like they don't care about our community, and a few of them do, but what the tearing down of all those trees behind in the tract back there that was privately owned, Bowling Creek, just because he could, where the town tried to buy it at fair market value, right? So it's like, what do you do with that? All I can say is that is like the robbing of someone of their understanding of themselves as a participant in a human and non-human community, and that is the consequence of this way of thinking.
So
right?
the ownership is like the most important thing, where they tore down all those trees on Martin Luther King and Estes, and everybody was in a state of shock, and well, no, he owned the land, he can do what he wants,
Right.
and I'm thinking, really, is that how we want our lives to go? You own something, you can just do whatever the heck
Right.
you want.
And you start getting people terrified when you raise private property up.
Oh yeah,
people are like, what do you mean? You could just take my, my particular thing. But it is also remarkable to realize how, private property isn't historically older than, like, commonly held property, right? Like, private property had to actually be enshrined in the Constitution and named as that, which we defend.
Yes, it's become
people,
like this sacred. It's sort of up there like a sacred God. It's like not to be trifled with, not to be criticized. Yeah. So,
except when eminent domain is used because capital needs it. That's the irony, right?
Yeah. So how are the students responding well to the class to have their assumptions challenged and take a look?
Yeah, I think, there's a mixed bag, because I teach a 200-person version of this class, and then right now I'm teaching my smaller 35-person version of this class.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's lovely to be in a smaller class, but, I have many students come back to take my more, like, social change-oriented classes to be like, okay, how do we...
So they must like what they're...
Yeah, but I wouldn't say it's all 200 of them, right? So, but, that's never going to happen, because people have different passions and also schedules and all this stuff. So I would say I get good responses from students. I also think I get, ones that I don't hear about as often, about, like, people that are very angry and find me to be, very biased and all of these things. And I definitely am biased, and I've said that. Like, I'm one of those professors that has a strong opinion, but I am very happy to engage in other strong opinions. Like, I don't, it doesn't affect, So we've been talking recently with my students about like because several of them are in Econ 101 and they're taking my class, and so they're like, this is so interesting, and some of them are really enjoying the contrast, and it's just been occurring to me like it would be great to actually have an open discussion with the economists, right? Because I think what I have understood, what I have seen, and again, like people might think of me as arrogant when I say this, is that I think economists have been so captivated by the work that they do as mathematical, scientific, and objective that they have forgotten the historical, philosophical, and cultural nature of the endeavor that they're in. And I think that it might even be empowering to them, to like understand if they actually start thinking about the original questions that were asked by their, the forefathers of economics as a discipline, which again was a philosophical area of
Would
debate.
maybe move it out of being called the dismal science, it would be much more an attractive science because it would have more heart to it and more
and science,
complexity
many scientists I know at least are the first to admit that there's a lot of messiness and noise in science, and the idea of science being this objective, rational, impersonal thing that the eye of the observer doesn't affect what they find is far from the truth, right? And so, yes, the fact of economics being what it is. I also want to say there are other kinds of economics. Like we talk about economics as if it's simply neoclassical economics, but there are heterodox economics, feminist economics. Now there's ecological economics. There's different interesting approaches to economics out there, and I think part of the problem that we are in with capitalism at this particular moment in time is the forgetting that this is one version of economy, and that's what I mean. So I think that I love teaching this stuff because at the very least what it gets my students to do is start asking questions about those things we have taken for granted as just the way things are, and also, in particular with economics, it makes us, wonder what is our point in life, simply to get a job that pays really well, or are there other criteria that we want to consider?
Yeah. Well, I just got the high sign from Iris that
I talk a lot,
we end about 5 because of TV or something constraints. So thank you so much. We learned a lot. I learned a lot about what we don't know, and also about some good books to further our own knowledge. And thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
It is. It just can go in so many directions once you get talking about people's lives and how we live it and how our community lives it and how our nation lives it and what our